Thank you. All right, so thank you everyone for coming out today. My name is Aunshul Rege, and I am a junior professor with the Criminal Justice Department at Temple University. So my talk today is titled Adversarial Decision-Making in Critical Infrastructure Cyberattacks. Now before I get started on the actual talk, I want to tell you guys a little bit about me in that I've had a bit of an interesting trajectory. I actually started off as a developer. My first degree was actually in computer science, and I worked in the industry for about 2 years. And I was always thinking about folks at the other side of the table, and by that I mean the attackers. So who's out there that wants to get into our systems? Why do they want to do that? How are they going to do that? And so on. So I quit my job and I went back to school to study criminology. And the intention there was to be able to get the two disciplines to actually talk to each other. How can we combine the two and get a different perspective on cybercrime? Okay, so that's how I pretty much ended up where I am today. And in addition to cybercrime, some of my other areas of interest are organized crime, terrorism, and corporate crime. Specifically, within the cybercrime research arena, I am interested in the hybridity of crime, and by that I mean the physical cyber relationships, which are often overlooked. Trend analysis, so if we were to look at cybercrimes today, how are they different from when they started maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and so on, and how can we use that to predict where they might go from here? I'm also interested in the organizational dynamics. So how have technologies impacted the way that criminals, both in physical space and what we call cyberspace, change their organization? Okay. Attack anatomy, how can we dissect an attack and learn more about the sophistication of the attack and the sophistication of the attacker? And finally, decision making, which is what I'm going to be sharing with you all today, which is how does someone make decisions about targeting system A versus system B, using technique A versus technique B. I'm going to attack at time T versus time whatever. Okay, so how does that decision making occur? What is going on in the attacker's mind? What is the attacker's thought process? So how the talk is structured, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I decided to pick critical infrastructures, and bless you, and in particular the power grid. I'm going to give you a very quick explanation of what criminology is, which will not do the discipline any justice at all, but I want to at least give you an idea of what this framework is. I want to share some of my data with you. We're going to talk about the concept of the intelligent and adaptive adversary, and what does that mean for our defense? And then in closing, I want to share some of the research that we're currently doing at Temple. So before I get into this, there's a few folks that I have to thank. DEF CON, EnergySec, Infracritical, NERC, and the SANS Institute. They were all helpful in making this research happen. They helped provide the feedback for the research and the data collection instruments. They helped me get the word out, and they also helped me recruit subjects. So this study would just not have been possible without the folks listed up here on the screen. So why electricity? Okay, and for those of you who've attended some of the other talks here today, there's obviously a lot of media hype about this, right? Our critical infrastructures, Cyber Pearl Harbor, and so on and so forth. So why the power grids? Well, it is a very large and complex infrastructure. It's got about 15,000 generators and 10,000 power plants. It's got hundreds of thousands of miles in transmission lines and distribution networks. Its estimated worth is $800 billion. Okay? So obviously a very important infrastructure, very large and complex and very expensive. And they rely on industrial control systems, which basically help you manage dispersed sites from a centralized location. And research indicates that they are actually the most vulnerable critical infrastructure. And did anyone here attend the Mr. Scotus's talk earlier today? Okay, so right there. It's also considered to be the worst prepared for such an attack, and the one to have the most detrimental consequences. So here we have one of many reports that are done there that will say the same thing. But power grids are considered to be a prime target for cyber attack because they depend on several embedded systems that are communicating with each other through potpourri of wired, wireless, cellular, and dial-up modems. Okay, and what this does is it increases the attack surface. And also some of these systems are legacy systems, so they're about 30 or so years old, which again makes them very vulnerable to attacks. And of course, there is the issue of cascading impacts, right? Power grids are considered to be the backbone for a lot of other critical infrastructures. So chances are, if you take down the power grid, you're going to end up having some sort of a ripple effect across some other critical infrastructures. So for these reasons, I thought, all right, the power grid is a good sort of infrastructure to look at. So obviously, a very important area. There's a lot of research that's been done in it, a lot of technical research that's been done that's looking at what techniques are being used, what vulnerabilities are being exploited, and within that technical realm, there's some indication of who might target these systems, right? So you have individuals, organized crime groups, terrorists, nation states, and then there's also some indication of why they do it, right? Well, I don't want to pay my power bill. Okay, I want to do this, I'm a disgruntled insider. I want to cause the United States harm, I want to instill fear in its citizens. I just want to learn more about my enemy, I want to understand the blueprints of the power grid, and perhaps if I know enough, I can use this sort of cyber attack as another arm of war. So, again, a lot of technical research sits more on this side, with some indications of what these might be. So why do we need criminology? Okay. So for those of you in the audience, I have to ask, how many of you actually know what criminology is? Okay, one, maybe. Okay, we're not this. Okay, we're not CSI. We're not. Okay. I cannot tell you how many students enroll in the criminal justice program because this is what we think we do. We don't. Nor do I do this. Okay. Nor will I tilt my head funny and look at you and try to understand your psychology. Okay, so I don't do that either. Okay, so what is it that we do? Well, here, this is what we do. Okay, it is the study of crime, criminals, crime victims, theories explaining illegal or deviant behavior, the social reaction to crime, the effectiveness of anti-crime policies, and the broader political terrain of social control. This was the best possible definition I could find regarding our discipline. Okay? So this talk is going to be focused on crimes, criminals, a little bit about the effectiveness of anti-crime policies. All right, and again, it's such a large discipline and there's just so many areas that we can address with it. So, when we're talking about why would someone target the power grid, some of the responses that you get are revenge, financial, political, espionage. What are these? What are all of these? Motives, right? They're motivations. But how else can you answer the question of why? Why would somebody target the power grid? That is not motivational. Right? But why? Because it's easy to, right? There's something about that environment, right? It's easy to access. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that can be exploited. So you have the same question, but there's two different responses to it. So if we put the power grid cyber attack on a timeline, the motivational aspects are what we call in criminology the distant causes of crime. because they're happening further away from the incident. And so these causes of crime here that are related to the environment are what we call the near causes of crime. It's something about that environment. And this talk is going to be looking at these, the near causes of crime. Why? Well, we can't really do very much about the motivation, okay? We can't go and change the adversary's frame of mind. We're not going to be able to do that. But we can do something about the environment, right? That can impact that adversary's decision-making process. So if we look at those system-specific factors, those environment-related factors, those near causes of crime, a lot of technical research will do that, okay? How do we improve our perimeter access? How do we improve our authentication protocols? And so on and so forth. So a lot of research looks at the tactics of how someone might target the system. And of course, that's very, very important. That needs to be done. But that's only part of the story, right? If we focus purely on tactics, what we're doing is we're putting the adversary in the back seat. Okay, the adversary then becomes passive, someone who, and we downplay the adversary's underlying strategy. But the adversary isn't passive. Our adversary is intelligent and is going to plan and execute a strategy that is well thought out. And this is where criminology really comes into the picture. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of theories. One in particular is extremely useful in this particular case, which is the rational choice perspective. And this basically views the adversary as an active individual, someone who actually engages in a cost-benefit analysis. So this is someone who learns from his experiences, will adapt to her environment, will engage in a continuously evolving decision-making process. Okay, and this is important because we need to understand the strategy, because ultimately strategy is what's going to determine the tactic. So what impacts the adversary's strategy or that decision-making process? Well, we have those system-specific factors, right? Those near causes of crime, that environment. But there's other factors too that are external to the system, and those are adversary-specific. So, what are those? Well, what types of resources are available to the adversary? What is the adversary's knowledge base? Is the adversary working alone or in alliances? And if you're working in partnerships, how does that impact your skill set? Okay, so we need to understand that system-specific factors are only part of the equation. It's a combination of both that's going to determine how the power grid cyber attack is going to happen. So what might these factors be? So I went through the literature, I went through technical reports, government documents, media cases, and so on. And I came up with about 9 factors that are both system and adversary specific that can be accounted for by the acronym PARE RISKS, right? So, excuse me. So we have system-specific factors like prevention measures, ease of access, system weaknesses, and so on. But then we also have those attacker-specific factors, right? What types of skills do they have, who are they working with, and so on. So yay, I've created this framework, but how good is it? Now I can't go out there and actually interview the adversary who's engaged in cyber attacks against the power grid. So I do the next best thing that's possible. I went out and I surveyed and I interviewed hackers, pen testers, power grid representatives, vendors, control systems vendors, and see what they had to say about this. And for the most part, the framework did well. There were a few revisions in that, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But what I want to share with you are some of those findings that came out of the data. And I'm not going to talk about the system-specific factors because that's, as I mentioned, there's a lot of research already in the area. Well, what I do want to share with you are some of those adversary-specific factors. Now, I can't, again, share all of that with you in the time that we have, but I am going to talk about some of them. So what might these be? Money is a very important resource, okay, depending on what it is that you want to do. So, as this industry representative said, a single 0-day can go for about $100,000, and this particular attack had about 4 of them. So, coupled with a digital certificate that on the black market goes for anywhere between 100 and 200K, if we start adding all of these numbers up, we see that this was a very expensive attack. Very well funded, probably state-sponsored. Okay, so obviously, money is a very important resource, again, depending on the sophistication of your attack. What is it intended to do? Another important resource, time, right? You can't design sophisticated attacks, such as that particular one, in a couple of weeks, okay? It requires months worth of planning and preparation. So, anything from just studying your target, developing the attack, and so on and so forth, finding the right people to work with, and all of that. So those were some of the resources. How do you actually prepare for the attack? Okay, so how much of that attack preparation requires research? So here we have a pen tester saying, if my goal is to bring down a generation plant, 50 to 75% of the legwork is just to learn as much as I can about the system beforehand. So it could be through social engineering, researching the vendors, these are the control systems vendors, and perhaps even getting your hands on a copy of the system. Okay? So once you do all of this, you really understand your target well. You really understand its vulnerabilities well. And hey, if you get your hands on a copy of the system, you can even test out your attack. You can tweak it up, fine-tune it, and then go live with it. Okay, so research is a big chunk of actually preparing for the attack before you go live with it. How are alliances formed? Okay. Again, for this particular context, one industry representative said, well, I don't think the vulnerability guys knew the control systems guys. I don't think they even knew where their code was going, and I don't think they even cared. Okay? So what might this suggest? Well, we might have some sort of a cell structure, and each cell is perhaps completely autonomous in whatever it's scheduled to do, whatever its task is. So it might not know where its particular piece of the puzzle is going. It might not know how many other puzzle pieces there are. It might not know how big the puzzle is or what it's going to look like when all the different pieces come together. Okay, so what we see is a cell structure in this particular case that might be autonomous yet anonymous. Okay, so none of the other cells might know who else is involved. How are the cells formed? Well, that depends on the type of skills that we're looking for. So, as this pen tester said, you might have someone who's specializing in malware, another one who's specializing in command and control, someone who's a control systems engineer. Okay, now I think we know which attack we're talking about, right? Siemens software. And somebody else who knew the hardware platform inside and out. So about 6 people, perhaps 6 cells. Okay, so this just gives us a glimpse into what's happening before the attack even progresses. And these are all important because that's going to shape the adversary strategy. So, like I said, I can't talk about all of them, but here they are, okay? So we have the adversary-specific factors, right? We looked at some of them. System-specific, right? That's not something new, right? How are you going to gain access to the system? How are you going to bypass any prevention measures? How are you going to exploit any weaknesses? But this was something new, okay? This was not something I was expecting to come out from the data. And I found this very interesting, is the fact that the adversary is engaging in a strategy. So now I've moved beyond looking at the factors that impact the decision-making process. But what this suggests is that there's something going on that's more than that. That the adversary strategy is actually a step-by-step account of what should happen before you go in and conduct your cyber attack. So for instance, is the target going to respond? What's your counter response going to be? What are your exit strategies should you need to do that, okay? So in criminology, this is what we call the crime script, which is basically a step-by-step account of how the crime process is going to play out. What are the different stages of the crime? Which is also called a decision tree, okay? Or an attack plan. So here we have two different pen testers' quotes. The attack plan will be comprised of branches and sequels at each point of penetration and attack in the system. Okay? I figured out what ports I can get on, what IDs and passwords I'm going to use, how I'm going to come in, and once I enter the system, how am I going to control whatever's going on. So this demonstrates that the adversary, again, is a very rational actor, someone who is, again, engaging in a full-formed strategy before actually commencing the attack. So this was not the goal of the study when it started off. This is something that kind of came up. And so I went back to my data and I said, well, let's see if I can start piecing together what this crime script might look like, right? So you got to prepare for the attack, right? We looked at some of this. You need to find the right people to work with. You need to have the right types of resources. You need to start researching your target and coming up with an attack plan. Once you have all of that, you're going to enter the system that you wish to target. Well, how are you going to enter it? Right? These are those system-specific factors now. That environment, right? So you're going to access it. How are you going to access it? How are you going to bypass prevention, and so on and so forth. Once you're inside the system, how are you going to introduce your attack vector into that environment? Okay? How are you going to introduce that technique that you've, assuming that it's been well planned and prepared in that stage one, how are you now going to introduce it into your environment? And here we start seeing sort of the preliminary branches of that decision tree. Well, does your target respond? Let's assume in this particular case that it does not. You keep continuing the attack up until the point of completion, so you've disrupted the power plant, you've modified data, whatever it might be, and you exit the system. So you remove any traces of the fact that you were actually in there. Alternatively, the target could respond. It could isolate the infected system, which is actually a common strategy. So the question then becomes is, do you have a counter response? Well, there's a few, okay? If I'm an attacker, and if I was a smart attacker, I would usually have second or third channels or paths back into the infrastructure. So you're going to find alternate access paths. If the system has been isolated, then I'm going to try to go through and gain control of one of the other systems. So now you shift your target of choice. Okay, so you move to another part of the system. Alternatively, you might have to change your tactic. So if the adversary can't get in remotely, the tactics absolutely have to change. Okay, it could be physical penetration. It could be penetration into assets that are connected to the network, but not necessarily to the outside world. So again, this demonstrates that the adversary is adapting to changes in the environment. And of course, if there's no counter response, you exit the system and perhaps you have to go back to that drawing board. Okay, so this is a very, very rudimentary crime script because we just don't know enough. Okay, as I mentioned, this was not the objective of the study. This is something that kind of emerged from it. So this is what we're looking at right now, but bear with me a few minutes here, okay? Yes, it's rudimentary. But what does this mean for defense? Okay, if we have the adversary's crime script, What does that mean? So what can you do in that preparation stage to make the adversary's life difficult? Which one of these three can you actually do something about? Any stabs at it? Sorry? Resource, but if it's state-sponsored, how are you going to be able to do that? If it's an advanced persistent threat, right, the APT, which one of these three is somewhat in your control? Sorry? In this stage, for the adversary's preparation. Research, right? How are they studying your system? So what can you do about that? You want to disrupt the research part of that stage. So you want to limit or control or find an alternate means of having information. You know, how much information do you want about that control system available online? So one pen tester actually said, people are so proud of their work, they take the work that they've actually done and publish it in these beautiful PDFs and put it out there. And that's all that the attacker needs. Okay, a lot of vendors will do this is that they provide a lot of information about their product on their websites. So not only do you want to be able to limit the type of information that's available about the control system, you also want to limit the availability of the actual control system. What do I mean by that? Another pen tester's quote, you can buy control systems for a fraction of a cent on the dollar on eBay. You buy it, you break it, and you post it. There are hundreds, many hundreds of vulnerabilities on SCADA and control systems technology specific to the power sector. Okay, so especially if this is someone who is state-sponsored, where money is not an issue, you can even buy the more expensive stuff. Okay, and you can mirror the environment and practice your attack out on the very system that you're actually going to go ahead and target. Okay, so we want to be able to make the adversary's life a little bit difficult by making it harder for them to gain information about your target. So you can do something even before the attacks actually started. Okay? What can we do at stage 2? Entry. You want to limit access, right? You want to limit access to your system. And this was mentioned at quite a few talks here, which is you want to improve those authentication protocols. And this could be anything that's, password related, for instance. And I can't go through, again, all of those, examples of what can be done. But here's one in particular. You still see a massive amount of systems configured with default usernames and passwords that haven't been changed since they were installed 15 to 20 years ago. Okay, so we need to do something about that. Look, we can't prevent cyber attacks from happening, but we can make the adversary's life a little bit more difficult. Right? You also want to increase the employee's awareness. So we can walk into companies and say, hi, I'm so-and-so from so-and-so, and we're here to fix your computer system. Oh, not a problem. Here's our data center. So do you have to be sophisticated if you have to physically break in? No, it's a piece of cake. If you look the part, you talk the part, chances are you're going to be okay. You've gotten access into the system, and a lot of pen testers have actually done this, and it works. So what can we do to educate our employees? Tell them that these types of situations are possible. Check the credentials of the person walking through that front door and make sure that he or she is who he or she claims to be. Stage 3, initiation. What can we do to figure out that that the attack has commenced? Realize that we're under attack. You want to be able to detect that. So you want to improve real-time intrusion detection. Okay, so this, and I've heard this in the talks over here as well, is, well, let's look back at our logs and see what happened. Let's see if we can identify any anomalies. Well, why not find a system in place to realize that you're under attack now? So here's a quote from, actually there were several pen testers who had this to say, but this is the best quote that I found. Okay, so some industry representatives would know that they're being attacked, emphasize the word some, most wouldn't even have a clue. Okay? So we need to do something about improving the detection process. Target response, right? We saw one of them. What is the purpose of isolating the system? You want to disrupt the attacker's flow, right? You want to make it more difficult for the adversary. So, there's general best practices strategy where you isolate the systems, eradicate the infection, and then recover the system to a pre-infected state. Okay, so you want to, by taking the system offline, by isolating it, what you're doing is making the adversary change. Okay, now the adversary has to put in some effort and continue. So you want to disrupt that continuation process. So I hope you get where I'm going with this, okay, is that this is a rudimentary crime script, and we got at least preliminary suggestions of what we can do. But if we get more information about what this crime script might be, and we realize that our adversary is someone who is going to adapt, going to change, going to evolve, then we need to have a defense that does that as well. You need to be able to stay on par with the adversary as the crime script progresses. And so that's what we're looking at Temple. Okay, we really want to understand what that crime script is. So we need to realize that a cyber attack is a process. It has something going on before the attack commences. Okay? And of course, there's an attack in progress stage. And that's where we're joining up with the engineering team, engineering department on campus. Okay? So what are we doing? Well, we're going to now interview pen testers and ask them about what a crime script might look like. Okay, and go into as much depth as possible. So we're doing one-on-one interviews with them, but we're also going to put them in focus groups so they can have a conversation together and come up with a crime script. And we're going to take this information, so we're going to bring human agency into the equation, and we're going to put it into a multi-agent simulation model. So what we're going to do then is bring control systems into this environment and see how for each stage of that crime script, for all of those possible branches and sequels, how does the system behave? And if we can anticipate all of the adversary's moves, we can come up with corresponding defense strategies. Okay, so the goal here is to come up with an interactive and adaptive crime prevention script that is going to parallel the adversary's crime script. So as, again, one of the response was isolate the infected system, we have 3 possible counter responses. But there's other responses too. The target could leave the attack running just to gather information about the adversary. Or you could feed false data back to the adversary to see what's the adversary going to do next with this information. So this is a great way of understanding the adversary's methodologies. And of course, you can always hack back. And for those of you who attended the talk yesterday for why not to hack back, but it's still a strategy that can be done. But the question is, for each of these, what might the counter response be? Okay, that's something that we don't know, and that's what we're interested in finding out. So, in a nutshell, that's pretty much what I had for you. Where does that leave me and the folks at Temple? Well, this is all very exploratory, okay? We need to know a lot more. We know that adversarial decision-making can be expressed as some function of those factors, but that's all we know. We don't know, for instance, if some of those factors are more important than others, if there's a temporal sequence there, if there's any causal relationships between the factors. We don't know how do the factors emerge and subside in importance as the crime script progresses. We're also very interested in the application of game theory, okay? So if we, again, can come up with all possible moves of the adversary, what might the corresponding counter moves of the defender be? Okay, and we can create what Tyndall calls a cyber attack playbook, where we can project all possible moves and come up with those strategies to defend our systems. I often get this question, well, what about other infrastructures? Can we say this is the same? My response is, well, we don't know that yet, okay, because we don't have enough to talk about our current infrastructure of choice, which is the power grid. And of course, we need to talk about it. I cannot tell you how frustrating it was to be able to get people to talk about these issues. I would go at a conference and say, so folks would ask me, so what are you studying? And I said, oh, well, this is what I'm doing. Oh, that's interesting. Well, would you like to participate in this study? No, we can't talk about it, right? But I'm not looking for actual incidents. I'm looking for your perceptions about how an adversary might behave. Yeah, we still can't talk about that, but we want to know what you come up with, right? So it's very hard to offer something if I have poor data to go on, okay? So if there's any data sets that are available without any identifiers that give us information for how the crime process plays out, for instance, we can take that and embed that into case study research. Okay, and we can go to the pen testers and say, hey, here's a case. What do you think the adversary's strategy was? So that's sort of where we are currently at Temple. That's pretty much all I had for you. So again, thank you for coming out, and if there's any questions, comments, feedback, criticisms, I welcome them. So thank you very much. Yes?
Yeah, I had a question because, you definitely kind of alluded to framing the question that game theory wrestles with model. And there definitely seems to be, then, if you put it that way, a need to distinguish between repeated interaction and like single game flow, because if there is some sort of equilibrium that you're going to find through your restless race model, that repeated interaction with the company, if the adversary figures out that this company likes to hack back, maybe it doesn't become as juicy of a target the second time. So is there a way that you can fit that kind of behavior into your model?
At this stage, I'm going to have to say, well, we just don't know at the moment, okay? And that's part of the reason. I mean, one of the next exercises that we hope to get from this is to pit the pen testers against each other, okay? And see how would they do that sort of back and forth, strategy. But that's, again, at this stage, we don't know. I mean, you could go with all sorts of complexities of the game theory, right? You could have cooperative and non-cooperative and all sorts of variations there. So there's a lot of room for us to really explore these sorts of phenomena. But again, we need people to talk. So we can only go so far. I mean, that's the classic standard of any model, right? Garbage in, garbage out. We need people to open up and talk about this. And again, we don't have to look at this from a critical infrastructure perspective either. Any type of crime is going to have a crime script, right? So if there's any other type of data, it doesn't have to be critical infrastructure related, that's proprietary or, national security or anything like that. But if we can get that information, we're still good to go. I guess that's it. All right, thanks.